On the night of December 20th, 1891, the temperature in Ember Ridge, Wisconsin fell to 31 degrees below zero. It was the coldest reading in 15 years. The sky was black and clear and full of stars that looked like chips of broken ice scattered across glass. The wind came from the northwest, steady and merciless, driving the wind chill down past 50 below. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 4 minutes. Breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves the mouth. Trees crack and split open like gunshots in the dark. Families huddled around fireplaces that couldn't keep up. Chimneys cracked from the swings between fire and frost. Iron pipes froze and burst, flooding kitchens with water that turned to solid ice within minutes. A cord of seasoned hardwood that should have lasted a month was gone in 2 weeks. People burned chairs. People burned tables. People burned books and dresser drawers and anything else that would catch. 2 children would die that week. A farmer would lose 4 fingers and 2 toes. 3 roofs would collapse under the weight of snow. And the people of Ember Ridge, every single one of them, would come to understand what it meant to be truly cold. But on that same night in a leaning woodshed 12 miles outside of town, a thin column of smoke rose from somewhere near the back wall. Inside, a Holstein cow stood calmly in a makeshift pen chewing straw, her breath steaming in slow clouds. The space smelled like animals and earth and wood smoke. And beneath the floor, 6 feet below the frozen surface of the earth, a woman lay sleeping on a bed of straw and wool and deer hide. She was not shivering. She was not frostbitten. The air around her held steady near 55 degrees. The walls of her shelter were smooth, bare earth, dry and solid, radiating the kind of warmth that the ground holds in its bones all winter long. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 32 years old. She was a widow. She had no money, no family within 200 miles, and no legal right to the land she was sleeping on. 6 weeks earlier, the whole town had said she would be the first to die. To understand what Clara did, you have to understand what she lost. Her husband, Robert Whitfield, died on the 14th of April, 1891. Pneumonia. He was 40 years old, brought across the shoulders, strong enough to split a full cord of oak in a single afternoon. He had hands like shovels and a quiet laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He could fix anything. A broken axle, a cracked beam, a stuck well pump. He once rebuilt the entire south wall of their cabin in 3 days after a storm tore it loose. He did it alone in the rain because that was who he was. The sickness took him in 6 days. It started with a cough. Just a cough. He waved it off the way he waved off everything that wasn't a fence post or a feed bill. By the second day, the cough had turned wet and heavy. By the third, he couldn't stand without leaning on the doorframe. Clara boiled water. She pressed hot cloths to his chest. She brewed tea from dried mint and honey and sat beside him through the night, listening to his breathing turn into something that sounded like gravel rolling in a tin pail. On the 4th day, his fever spiked. His skin turned the color of old candle wax. His eyes, which had always been sharp and steady, and the color of riverstone, went glassy and distant. He stopped recognizing her. He called out for his mother, who had been dead for 11 years. He called out for a dog he had had as a boy. He grabbed Clara's wrist once hard and said, "Don't let the fire go out." She didn't know if he meant the fireplace or something else. On the 5th day, he stopped speaking altogether. On the 6th day, April 14th, at just past 4 in the morning, Robert Whitfield exhaled one long, slow breath and did not take another. Clara sat beside him for 2 hours. She did not scream. She did not cry. She held his hand, which was still warm, and she watched the light change through the window. The birds started before dawn. A cardinal, then a wren. The world kept going like it hadn't noticed. She buried him herself. Dug the grave at the far edge of the south pasture near a stand of white birch trees he'd always liked. The ground was soft from spring rain, and she worked the shovel until her palms split and bled. It took her the better part of 2 days. She wrapped him in a quilt her mother had made, lowered him in with ropes tied to fence posts, and filled the hole one shovel at a time. She didn't mark the grave with a cross. She marked it with a flat piece of limestone she carried from the creek bed half a mile away. She scratched his name into it with the tip of a nail. Robert Whitfield, 1851 to 1891. Below his name, she scratched one more line. He built everything, and that was true. The cabin they lived in, the barn, the woodshed, the fences, the root cellar, the chicken coop, the stone chimney that drew clean and never smoked back. Robert had built it all with his own hands over the course of 12 years. He'd come to this land in 1879 with $40, an axe, and a team of borrowed horses. He cleared the timber himself. He dug the well himself. He hauled the foundation stones from a quarry 6 miles to the east and set them level using nothing but a length of twine and a jar of water. Clara had been at his side for every bit of it. They married in 1880 when she was 21 and he was 30. She wasn't tall, she wasn't heavy, but she could carry 2 full water buckets across a frozen yard without spilling a drop, and she could dress a deer faster than most men in the county. She kept the garden. She kept the chickens. She smoked meat, canned fruit, mended fences, patched the roof twice, and once pulled a calf out of a breech berth at 3 in the morning during a thunderstorm while Robert was away trading horses in Wausau. They never had children. It wasn't for lack of wanting. It just never happened. Clara didn't talk about it. Robert didn't either. It sat between them like a stone in a river, something in the water just moved around. They loved each other in the way that people love each other after years of shared labor and silence and cold mornings and warm suppers. Not with grand gestures, with presence, 11 years together on that land. 87 acres of mixed woodland and pasture, a single-room cabin with a stone chimney, a woodshed, a barn that leaned slightly to the east. And then he was gone. Robert's brothers arrived 31 days after the funeral. There were 2 of them. Harlan was the eldest, 38 years old, tall and angular, with a narrow face and pale eyes that never seemed to blink at the right time. He spoke slowly, carefully, the way a man speaks when he's already decided what he's going to say and doesn't care what you think about it. He wore a wool coat with brass buttons and carried a leather satchel that he held against his chest like a shield. Virgil was 35, shorter than his brother, thicker through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone Robert used to build the chimney. But where Robert's strength had been quiet and steady, Virgil's was restless, aggressive like a dog pulling at a chain. He had always looked at Clara with something close to contempt. She knew why. She'd always known. In Virgil's mind, a wife who couldn't bear children was a wife who had failed at her only job. He'd said it once years ago at a family gathering, not to her face, but loud enough for her to hear. What's the point of a woman who can't give you a son? Robert had nearly broken his jaw over that. They hadn't spoken for 2 years after. Now Virgil stood in her dooryard with his arms crossed and his chin lifted and his eyes scanning the property like he was already measuring it for new fences. Harlan did the talking. He was polite about it the way a banker is polite when he tells you your loan is overdue. He opened the leather satchel and removed a set of papers, yellowed and creased with a wax seal at the bottom. The deed. He unfolded it on the porch rail and pointed to the name at the top, Ezekiel Whitfield, Robert's father. The land, Harlan explained, had never been in Robert's name, not legally. Their father had purchased the original parcel in 1876 and had allowed Robert to settle it, to work it, to build on it. But the deed had remained in the family trust. Robert had been in the strictest legal sense a tenant, and Clara, as a woman with no blood relation to the Whitfield family and no children to carry the name forward, had no legal standing to remain. Clara listened. She stood on the porch of the cabin her husband had built with his own hands, the cabin she had lived in for 11 years, and she listened to a man she had never liked explain to her why none of it was hers. She looked at the papers. She looked at Harlan's pale eyes. She looked at Virgil, who was staring at the barn like he was already deciding whether to tear it down or repurpose it. 30 days, Harlan said. That's more than generous. Clara said nothing. You could go to Madison, he continued, or Milwaukee. There are churches that help women in your situation. You'd find work. Virgil snored and she could sweep floors. Clara looked at him, just looked. Virgil held her gaze for 2 seconds, then glanced away. 30 days, Harlan repeated. He folded the papers, slid them back into the satchel, and turned toward the wagon. Virgil followed, spitting once into the dirt as he went. They drove off without looking back. Clara stood on the porch for a long time after they left. The sun was going down. The air smelled like cold earth and pine, and the first distant hint of snow. Somewhere in the woods to the north, a barred owl called once, twice, then went silent. She went inside. She sat at the table. She put her hands flat on the wood, the same table Robert had built it from planks he'd milled himself, and she stared at the wall. She did not cry. She made a decision. Within a week, the brothers made good on their threats. The firewood deliveries stopped. Every winter for the past 12 years, the Whitfield family had shared wood from the main lot, a 60-acre stand of hardwood timber 5 miles to the southeast. It was a family arrangement, informal, unwritten, the kind of thing that held together because people chose to honor it. Harlan and Virgil chose not to. The grain from the family mill stopped too. No more flour, no more cornmeal beyond what Clara had already stored. No more salt pork from the autumn slaughter. They stopped acknowledging her existence entirely. If someone in town mentioned Clara Whitfield, Harlan would change the subject. Virgil would pretend he hadn't heard. It was a slow, deliberate erasure, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but breaks bones all the same. The neighbors noticed. The nearest ones were a Swedish family called the Lindgrens, a mile and a half to the south. Good people, quiet. They kept to themselves the way most people did in that part of the country, not out of cruelty, but out of habit and the simple mathematics of survival. Winter was coming. Everyone had their own problems. Some people in town whispered. Some felt pity. A few of the older women clucked their tongues and said it was a real shame what those Whitfield boys were doing. But shame didn't split firewood. Shame didn't keep the frost off the windows. Others thought Clara was a fool chasing pride. A woman alone, 32 years old, no money, no income, no children, no claim, 12 miles from the nearest settlement with nothing but a small woodshed, a cow named Bess, and 14 chickens. Why didn't she just leave, go south, find work, start over? They didn't understand. That land was not just a piece of property to Clara. It was Robert. Every fence post, every stone in the chimney, every beam in the ceiling carried the memory of his hands. She had stood beside him while he set them. She had handed him nails, held boards, steady mixed mortar, carried stones. She had cooked his meals after 16-hour days of building. She had sewn his gloves when they wore through. She had kept him alive, and he had kept her alive. And together they had turned 87 acres of raw Wisconsin woodland into something that worked. Leaving would mean admitting that none of it mattered. That 11 years of work in love in silence could be erased by a piece of paper with a dead man's name on it. Clara would not do that, but staying meant surviving a northern Wisconsin winter alone with almost nothing. And winter in that part of the state was not a metaphor. The record low in Ember Ridge had been 38 degrees below zero, recorded in January of 1888. People still talked about that winter. 4 people froze to death. Livestock perished by the hundreds. The river froze solid enough to drive a loaded wagon across. And that winter had been survivable only because people had prepared for it, had stockpiled wood and food and hay, had reinforced their homes and barns, had done everything right. Clara had almost nothing. A dwindling stack of firewood in the woodshed. Enough food to last maybe 6 weeks if she rationed carefully. A cow that would need feeding and watering through the coldest months. And a single-room cabin with gaps in the chinking that let the wind whistle through like a blade. She stood in the dooryard on the 1st of November and looked at the sky. It was the color of old pewter. The air had that particular stillness that comes just before the season turns, when the earth seems to hold its breath. 3 weeks until winter hit in earnest, maybe less. She needed a plan, and this is where the story turns. Because Clara Whitfield had something that nobody in Ember Ridge knew about. Not Robert's brothers, not the neighbors, not the whispering women at the Lutheran church. Nobody. She had her father, not the man himself. Isaac Mercer had been dead for 9 years, taken by a stroke in 1882. But he had left her something more valuable than money or land or livestock. He had left her knowledge. Isaac Mercer was born in 1829 in a town called Connellsville in Fayette County, southwestern Pennsylvania. Coal country. He went into the mines at 14 and stayed underground for 18 years. He descended into shafts that ran 300 feet below the surface, where the air was thin and tasted like iron, and the darkness was so complete that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. He worked with a pickaxe and a headlamp in the knowledge that the ceiling above him could come down at any moment and bury him alive. He survived 3 cave-ins. The first one killed 2 men beside him. The second trapped him for 11 hours in a space no bigger than a coffin. The third broke his left shoulder and collapsed his left lung and left him with a cough that never fully went away. In 1868, when Clara was still an infant, Isaac moved his family west. He was done with the mines, done with the dark, done with watching men die underground for wages that barely kept their families fed. He settled in central Wisconsin, took up farming, and never went below ground again. But he remembered everything. And he taught his daughter. He started when she was 15. They were sitting by the fire on a January night, the wind howling outside, the temperature somewhere well below zero. Clara had asked him how miners survived when the tunnels collapsed, how they stayed alive in the dark with no food and no light, and the weight of the earth pressing down above them. Isaac had looked at her for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and then he told her. He told her about survival pockets, small chambers that miners would dig with their bare hands in the rubble after a collapse, spaces just big enough to sit up in, designed to conserve air and body heat. He told her about thermal mass, how stone and packed earth absorb heat slowly, but hold it for hours, radiating it back like a living thing. He told her about ventilation, how even a small shaft of moving air could mean the difference between life and suffocation. He told her about clay-rich soil, how it insulated better than wood, better than brick, better even than wool. And then he told her the most important thing of all. Cold kills fast above ground, girl, he said, his voice low and steady. Wind strips the heat right out of you. Doesn't matter how many blankets you've got. Doesn't matter how big your fire is. If the wind can reach you, the cold can kill you. He leaned forward. But 6 feet down, the earth holds steady, 55 to 70 degrees all winter long. Doesn't matter if it's January or July. The ground remembers warmth. Clara never forgot those words. She carried them the way some people carry scripture tucked away in a part of the mind that doesn't fade with time. She hadn't thought about them in years. She hadn't needed to. Now, 23 years later, standing in the cold November air, with nothing left and winter bearing down, she was going to bet her life on them. Clara began digging on the 3rd of November, 1891. She chose a spot directly beneath the woodshed. It was a simple structure 10 feet by 12 built by Robert in 1884 to store split firewood hand tools and a small grinding wheel. It sat on 6 flat limestone foundation stones instead of a proper footing, which meant there was a narrow gap between the floor and the ground. More importantly, it meant the floor could be accessed from below. The ground beneath the shed was a mixture of sandy loam and clay, dark and rich, still soft enough to break with a spade. Barely. Within a week, the frost line would descend past 6 inches and the earth would turn to iron. She had no time to waste. She worked during the day in 2-hour shifts to avoid exhaustion. She was strong for her size, but she was not a large woman, and the work was brutal. Each shovelful of earth weighed 3 to 4 pounds. She removed the soil one wooden bucket at a time, roughly 12 pounds per load, and carried it deep into the woods behind the property. She scattered it in the underbrush in the ravines, along the creek bank, anywhere it wouldn't be noticed. Fresh dirt on frozen ground is conspicuous. Clara knew that if Harlan or Virgil came by and saw evidence of digging, they'd investigate. They'd find the shelter. They'd destroy it. So she was careful. Every load was dispersed. Every trace was covered. No one came by. No one asked questions. The Lindgrens stayed on their own land. The churchwomen hadn't visited yet. Harlan and Virgil were done with her, or so they thought. Clara worked alone, her hands blistered by the second-day raw pink welts that split open and bled into the handle of the spade. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept digging. Her back seized on the fourth day a sharp bolt of pain that ran from her left hip to the base of her skull. She lay on the ground for 20 minutes staring at the underside of the woodshed floor, breathing through her teeth. Then she got up and kept digging. Her shoulders ached. Her knees swelled. Her fingers, even through the cloth wrappings, cracked and stiffened in the cold. At night, she soaked them in warm water and rubbed them with rendered tallow, working the joints until they loosened enough to close around a spoon. She ate sparingly, a handful of dried beans boiled into a thin soup, a piece of hardtack soaked in water until it was soft enough to chew. A spoonful of honey sometimes as a small rebellion against the grimness of everything. She talked to Bess. The cow stood in the barn chewing cud, watching Clara with large brown eyes that held no judgment. Clara told her about the shelter. She told her about her father. She told her about Robert, sometimes the way he used to whistle while he worked, and always the same tune of him he'd learned as a boy that she'd never been able to identify. Bess blinked and chewed. Within 9 days, Clara had carved out a chamber 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 5 feet deep at the center. The walls were raw earth, smooth and vertical, packed tight by the pressure of her spade and the flat of her hand. She'd shaped them carefully, working the surface until it was almost polished, eliminating loose pockets where soil might crumble and fall. The ceiling was the underside of the woodshed floor, supported by the original beams Robert had laid 7 years earlier. She reinforced those beams with 2 additional crossbars she salvaged from a collapsed fence near the property line. Each one was hewn from oak still solid despite 20 years of weathering. She notched them into the existing framework using a hand axe and a mallet, fitting them snug against the floor joists. The result was a ceiling that could bear the weight of the shed above the cow, the remaining firewood, and a season's worth of snow. But the chamber alone wasn't enough. Clara understood because her father had made sure she understood that a sealed underground space was a death trap. Without ventilation, carbon dioxide would build up within hours. Moisture from her breath would condense on the cold walls, making everything damp. The air would go stale, then toxic. She'd fall asleep and never wake up. So she built a ventilation system. She found a length of old stovepipe rusting near the barn. It was 4 inches in diameter and about 6 feet long, dented and discolored but structurally intact. She angled it upward from the rear corner of the chamber, threading it through a channel she dug near the back wall of the woodshed. The outlet emerged at ground level, behind the shed, hidden behind a stack of firewood she arranged to look natural. The physics were simple. Cold air being denser would sink into the chamber through the trap door whenever she opened it. Warm air rising naturally would exit through the pipe. The result was a gentle, continuous circulation, slow enough to preserve heat, but steady enough to keep the air breathable. It wouldn't work perfectly in every condition. Heavy snowfall could block the outlet. Ice could seal it shut. She'd have to monitor it, clear it, maintain it. But the principle was sound. Her father had taught her that too. She lined the floor of the chamber with 8 inches of dry straw she'd been storing in the barn since September, golden and sweet-smelling, still free of mold. Over the straw, she layered 3 wool blankets she'd sewn together from old coats, a quilt her mother had pieced together in 1872, from fabric scraps of a dozen different colors and 2 deer hides that Robert had tanned 3 winters ago. The hides were thick, supple, still smelling faintly of smoke from the tanning process. The combination created a sleeping surface that was soft, insulating, and waterproof. Then she built the oven. She walked to the creek bed half a mile away and selected stones. River stones, each one the size of a grapefruit, smooth and dense, chosen specifically for their ability to absorb and radiate heat. She carried them back 2 at a time in a canvas sack slung over her shoulder, making the trip 14 times over 2 days. 28 stones total. She built the oven in the northwest corner of the chamber, mortaring the stones together with a mixture of clay soil water and wood ash. Her father had taught her this mixture. The clay bonded the stones. The ash strengthened the mortar and made it resistant to cracking under heat. She shaped the oven carefully, building it no bigger than a bread box, with an interior volume of roughly 1 cubic foot. Small, deliberately small. A bigger oven would require more fuel and produce more smoke. Clara didn't need to heat a house. She needed to heat stones. The oven had a firebox at the base just big enough to hold a small bundle of sticks, a flat cooking surface in the middle where she could boil water or warm food, and a flue that vented through a second stovepipe, this one angled up through a natural crack she'd widened in the shed's back wall. The system was elegant in its efficiency. She would burn small sticks no thicker than her thumb in the firebox. The fire would heat the river stones surrounding it. Those stones, once heated to approximately 300 degrees, could be wrapped in cloth and placed around her sleeping area. They would radiate warmth for 4 to 6 hours. A single load of wood weighing less than 3 pounds could keep her comfortable through an entire night. By comparison, a traditional cast iron stove in a cabin consumed 15 to 20 pounds of wood per night and lost most of its heat through the chimney and the poorly insulated walls. Clara's system used a fraction of the fuel and lost almost none of the heat. The earth walls absorbed warmth and held it. The straw insulated the floor. The wool and deer hide trapped body heat against her skin. And the cow, 1,200 pounds of living warmth standing directly above her, radiated roughly 15,000 BTUs per day through the floorboards. It was, by any measure, a work of quiet brilliance. She stored her food in wooden crates sealed with melted candle wax to keep out moisture and rodents. She had 40 pounds of dried navy beans, 20 pounds of salted pork wrapped in cheesecloth, 30 pounds of hardtack biscuits, 18 pounds of cornmeal, a small sack of dried apples, and 2 jars of honey. It wasn't abundance, but rationed carefully, it would last through the worst of winter. She collected snowmelt in a copper pot and boiled it on the clay oven, purifying it and making it safe to drink. She made a pen for Bess inside the woodshed using loose boards, packing straw around it for insulation. The cow would stay above. Clara would stay below. They would keep each other alive. The trap door was the last thing she built. She cut it into the woodshed floor using a handsaw, working slowly to keep the cut clean. 2 feet by 3 feet, she hinged it with leather straps and installed a wooden peg on the underside that served as a latch. From above, with the trap door closed and firewood stacked on top of it, the opening was invisible. She climbed down for the first time on the evening of November 12th. She pulled the trap door shut above her, latched it from below, and sat in the darkness. The lantern flickered. The walls glowed faintly in the light, smooth and amber. The air was cool but still. No wind, no draft beyond the gentle movement through the ventilation pipe. She lit a small fire in the oven. The sticks crackled. The stones began to warm. Within an hour, the chamber was comfortable. Not hot, not even particularly warm by the standards of a well-heated home, but livable, sustainable, safe. Clara lay down on the straw and wool and deer hide, pulled the quilt to her chin, and stared at the earth ceiling 3 feet above her face. She thought about Robert. She thought about the grave at the edge of the south pasture under the birch trees, the limestone marker with his name scratched into it. She wondered if the ground was freezing around him, yet if the cold was reaching down to where he lay. Then she thought about what her father had said. 6 feet down, the earth holds steady. The ground remembers warmth. She closed her eyes. In mid-November, two women from the Lutheran church came by, Mrs. Greta Holgren and Mrs. Ann Pinson. They carried a wicker basket containing half a loaf of bread, 4 eggs, and a small jar of plum preserves. They found Clara outside in the late morning, chopping ice from the water's trough with the blunt end of an axe. She was wearing a wool coat that had belonged to Robert. It hung loose on her frame, the sleeves folded back twice at the cuffs. Her hands were red and raw. Her face was thinner than they remembered, the bones more prominent beneath the skin. But her eyes were clear and her movements were deliberate. She thanked them politely. She accepted the basket. She did not invite them inside. She did not explain anything. The women exchanged a look. They tried to make conversation. Wasn't she cold? Didn't she need help? Had she thought about the church's offer to arrange transport to Madison? Clara answered each question with as few words as possible. She was fine. She didn't need help. She wasn't going to Madison. They left. Mrs. Holgren told Reverend William Crane about the visit that evening. She sat in the front pew of the church, her hands folded in her lap, and said, "She's thin as a rail and pale as a ghost. She won't make it to Christmas. Someone should do something." Reverend Crane nodded slowly. He said he would pray for her. But praying was all he did, and no one else did anything either. The day before Thanksgiving, Clara heard boots on the frozen ground outside the woodshed. She was below in the chamber mending a tear in one of the deer hides by the light of the lantern. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, 2 sets. She knew who it was before they spoke. Harlan's voice came first, muffled through the floor. "Clara, open the door." She didn't move. "We know you're in there," Virgil said, louder, harder. "This is family land. You're trespassing." Silence. Virgil kicked the woodshed door. The whole structure shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling of the chamber, fine and dry, settling on Clara's hair and shoulders. "Open the door or we'll open it ourselves." They pushed into the woodshed. She could hear them moving above her, their boots on the floorboards inches from the trap door. Bess lowed nervously in her pen. One of them kicked a stack of firewood, and the logs clattered across the floor. "She's not here," Harlan said. "She's somewhere," Virgil said. A pause, then Virgil's voice, louder now, directed at the walls, the rafters, the cold air. "You hear me, Clara? You can hide all you want. Come January, we're filing with the county. This land goes back to the family. You've got no husband, no children, no claim, and no future here." Another pause. Then Virgil said, quieter but loud enough for her to hear through the floor, through the earth, through the straw and wool, and everything she had built to keep herself alive. "Let the winter have her. Save us the trouble." Harlan said nothing to contradict him. They left. The wagon creaked. The horse snorted. The sound faded south along the frozen road until there was nothing but the wind and the soft breathing of the cow above and the absolute silence of the earth below. Clara lay in the dark. Her hands were folded on her chest. Her eyes were open. She did not cry. She did not rage. She did not whisper a prayer or make a vow or do any of the things that people do in stories when they're supposed to feel something dramatic. She just lay there, breathing warm, alive. And that was enough. Outside, the temperature was 15 degrees and falling. The wind was picking up from the northwest, bending the tops of the pines, pushing the first thin clouds across the face of the moon. Winter was here, and Clara Whitfield was not leaving. December came to Ember Ridge the way a predator comes to wounded prey. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first major storm hit on the 8th. A low-pressure system rolled in from the Dakotas, dragging a wall of gray cloud that swallowed the horizon like a curtain being drawn across a stage. The snow started in the late afternoon, fat, heavy flakes that fell straight down in the windless air, covering the ground at a rate of nearly an inch per hour. By midnight, 6 inches lay across the fields and roads and rooftops of Ember Ridge. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees, then 0. Then kept falling. People adjusted. They always did at first. They stoked their fires. They brought their animals in close. They sealed their windows with rags and paper and anything else that might slow the cold. They told themselves this was normal. This was Wisconsin. This was winter. They'd been through it before, but this year was different, and somewhere deep in their bones, in that part of the body that understands danger before the mind admits it, they already knew. The general store ran out of lamp oil on December 10th. Herschel Davenport, the store's owner, a round-faced man with wire spectacles and an apron that was never quite clean, hung a hand-lettered sign on the door. No oil. Next shipment unknown. He stood behind the counter and watched the faces of the people who came in and read the sign and stood there for a moment processing what it meant. No oil meant no light after sundown. No light meant longer nights. Longer nights meant more wood burned, more food consumed, more hours spent in the dark, with nothing to do but listen to the wind and think about how much was left. The blacksmith's forge cracked on December 12th. A fissure ran through the base of the stone hearth, splitting it nearly in two. The blacksmith, a heavy-armed man named Dara Polk, stared at it for a full minute without speaking. He'd built that forge himself 14 years ago. He'd set every stone. And now the cold had found the weakness in the mortar, the single hairline fault that years of heat and frost had been slowly widening, and it had broken it open like a walnut. He couldn't repair it, not in this cold, not without new mortar that would freeze before it set. His forge was done until spring, which meant no repairs. No new hinges, no new tools, no new horseshoes, no replacement parts for the stoves and pipes and hardware that held the town's infrastructure together. Everything would have to last, everything would have to hold, and if it didn't, people would have to make do with what they had. The town tightened, conversations grew shorter, smiles grew rarer. People who had been generous in October became cautious in December. People who had been cautious became guarded. Every cord of firewood was counted, every sack of flour was measured, every egg was accounted for. The arithmetic of survival is simple and merciless. You have what you have. When it's gone, it's gone. And winter was only beginning. 12 miles outside of town, Clara Whitfield descended through the trap door each evening as the light faded and the cold set in. She latched the door above her. She lit the lantern. She built a small fire in the clay oven, feeding it sticks no thicker than her thumb, watching the flames lick at the river stones until they began to glow with stored heat. The routine had become something close to ritual. She milked Bess each morning and evening, storing the milk in a sealed tin pail she kept in the coolest corner of the chamber where the earth temperature held it just above freezing. She fed the cow hay and straw rationing, carefully calculating how many weeks the supply would last. She collected eggs from the chickens, fewer now as the day shortened and the cold deepened. Some days there were 3, some days there were none. She cooked once a day, usually in the late afternoon. A pot of beans simmered with a piece of salt pork. Cornmeal mixed with water and baked on the flat cooking surface of the oven into dense, heavy cakes that tasted like nothing but filled the stomach. Dried apple slices soaked in warm water until they softened into something that was almost sweet. She ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, making the meal last. Not because she was savoring it, because she was stretching it. She kept a tally on the wall of the chamber. Small marks scratched into the packed earth with the tip of a nail. One for each day. She didn't mark the date. She marked the supplies. Beans remaining, pork remaining, hardtack remaining, cornmeal remaining. Hay for Bess, straw for the floor, sticks for the oven, water collected, eggs gathered. The numbers told a story, and the story was tight. Not desperate, not yet, but tight. If the winter ran long, if something went wrong, if a supply ran out faster than expected, or a new need arose that she hadn't planned for, the margins would vanish. She was living on the edge of a blade, and the blade was made of arithmetic. But the shelter held. The temperature inside the chamber stayed near 55 degrees, sometimes dropping to 50 on the coldest nights, sometimes rising to 60 when she ran the oven longer than usual. Compared to the world above where the air could kill in minutes, it was paradise. She slept well, better in some ways than she had in months. The silence underground was absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the oven and the occasional shifting of the cow's weight on the floorboards above. The darkness was complete when she extinguished the lantern, so total that it pressed against her eyes like velvet. But it wasn't frightening. It was the darkness of the earth, the same darkness her father had known in the mines, and he had taught her not to fear it. The dark underground isn't empty, he had told her once. It's full, full of stone and soil and the weight of everything above you. It holds you, like a hand. Clara thought about that sometimes, lying in the dark with the quilt pulled to her chin, and the deer hides beneath her, and the straw beneath that, and the earth beneath everything. Held. That was the word. She thought about Robert less often now. Not because the grief had faded, it hadn't. It was still there, lodged in her chest like a stone, heavy and permanent and impossible to move. But grief, she was learning, is not incompatible with survival. You can carry it and still walk. You can feel it and still work. You can hold it in one hand and hold a shovel in the other. The stone doesn't get lighter. You just get used to the weight. The second storm arrived on December 17th. This one was different. The first storm had been heavy but brief, a single night of snow that buried the landscape and moved on. This one settled in like it intended to stay. It began in the morning with a sky the color of iron. The clouds hung so low they seemed to touch the treetops. The air had that peculiar electric stillness that comes before something massive, the way the world goes quiet before an avalanche or a flood. Animals know it before people do. Bess grew restless in her pen, shifting her weight, lowing softly. The chickens huddled in the corner of the shed, silent. The snow started at noon. Not the fat, lazy flakes of the first storm, but small, hard pellets, almost like sleet driven sideways by a wind, that came howling out of the northwest at 30 miles an hour and kept building. By evening, the wind was at 40. The snow was falling at 2 inches per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. 18 inches fell in 36 hours. The wind sculpted it into drifts that rose to windowsills, blocked doors, buried fences, erased roads. The world became white and featureless, a blank page with nothing written on it. And then after the snow stopped, the cold descended. Not gradually, not in stages. It dropped like a hammer. -12 on December 18th, -18 on the 19th, -23 on the morning of the 20th. And then at some point during the night, the mercury in the thermometer outside Herschel Davenport's general store slid past the lowest mark on the scale and kept going past the glass, past the numbers, past the point where measurement mattered. -31 degrees Fahrenheit. December 20th, 1891. The coldest night in Ember Ridge in 15 years. The stars overhead were hard and bright and utterly indifferent. The wind had died to almost nothing, which was somehow worse. In a gale, the cold is violent, aggressive, something you can fight against. In the stillness, it simply exists. It surrounds you. It enters you. It finds every gap in your clothing, every crack in your walls, every weakness in your body's ability to generate heat, and it takes what it wants. At -31 with no wind exposed, skin freezes in under 10 minutes. With even a slight breeze, the wind chill drops past 50 below, and the number becomes almost meaningless. The human body is not designed for it. The blood retreats from the extremities, pulling back to protect the core. Fingers go numb, then white, then hard. Toes follow. The shivering begins as a tremor and builds to a violence that rattles the teeth. And then paradoxically, it stops. The body gives up trying to warm itself. A strange calm settles in. The mind grows foggy, sleepy, warm even. People who are freezing to death often begin removing their clothing in the final stages, convinced they are overheating. They lie down in the snow. They close their eyes. They don't get up. The town broke apart that week, not all at once, but in pieces like ice calving from a glacier. Amos Pruitt was a farmer in his mid-50s who lived 2 miles east of the town center. He was a solid man built low to the ground with thick forearms and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hardwood he spent his days splitting. He'd farmed that land for 22 years. He knew winter. He respected it. On the night of December 21st, during the worst of the cold, he heard a sound from the barn. One of the horses was screaming, not whinnying, screaming. The kind of sound an animal makes when it is in genuine distress, the kind that reaches into the base of your skull and triggers something primal. Amos pulled on his boots, his coat, his hat, his gloves. He lit a lantern. He opened the back door. The distance from the house to the barn was 70 feet. He had walked it 10,000 times, in daylight, in rain, in snow, in every kind of weather Wisconsin could produce. 70 feet, half a minute's walk. He made it halfway. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside. Not like a wall, like a blade. It cut through his coat, through his shirt, through his skin, and went straight for the heat in his blood. The air was so cold it burned his throat when he inhaled. His eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. The lantern flame guttered and shrank, starved of oxygen by the dense frozen air. He kept walking. 1 step, 2, 5, 10. The barn was a dark shape ahead of him, barely visible. The horse screamed again. At 35 feet, his legs stopped working properly. The muscles in his thighs ceased cramping so violently that he staggered sideways. He caught himself, planted the lantern in the snow, and tried to keep going. His fingers, even inside the gloves, had lost all feeling. His face was numb. His vision was narrowing, the edges going dark as if someone were slowly closing a pair of shutters. At 40 feet he fell, face first into the snow. The lantern toppled and went out. The darkness was total. He tried to get up. His arms wouldn't cooperate. His legs were rigid. The cold was no longer something outside him. It was inside. It was in his blood, in his bones, in the marrow of his spine. He could feel it spreading inward, a slow, relentless tide claiming territory. He lay there. An hour later, his 16-year-old son, Daniel, found him. The boy had been watching from the kitchen window, waiting for his father to come back. When the lantern light disappeared, he waited 5 minutes, then 10. Then he pulled on every piece of clothing he could find and went out. He found his father face down in the snow, unconscious, his skin the color of blue chalk. Daniel was not a big boy, but fear gave him strength he didn't know he had. He grabbed his father under the arms and dragged him. 70 feet back to the house felt like a mile. His own hands were freezing. His own legs were going stiff. But he dragged him step by step through the door, across the kitchen floor to the fireplace. Amos survived, but his right hand was destroyed. 4 fingers frozen solid to the second knuckle, the tissue dead and blackening by morning. 2 toes on his left foot, the same. Dr. Leland Fenway, the town's only physician, a gaunt man with steady hands and a face that revealed nothing, came on Christmas Eve with a leather bag and a bone saw, and did what had to be done at the kitchen table, while Daniel held a lantern and tried not to look away. Amos didn't make a sound during the amputations. He stared at the ceiling and bit down on a leather strap and breathed through his nose. When it was over, Dr. Fenway wrapped the stumps in clean linen, left a bottle of laudanum on the table, and walked back out into the cold. Daniel found the horse dead in the barn the next morning, frozen stiff in its stall. Its eyes were still open. The Becker family lived in a 2-room house a mile north of the church. German immigrants, 5 children, the eldest 13, the youngest barely 2. The father, Friedrich, worked as a hired hand on the larger farms during planting and harvest and spent the winters doing carpentry and odd jobs. The mother, Katrine, did everything else. Their roof collapsed at 2 in the morning on December 19th, under the accumulated weight of 18 inches of snow and the structural failure of a center beam that had been slowly rotting for 3 years. The sound was enormous, a crack like a cannon shot followed by a grinding roar as the timbers gave way and the snow poured in. The family was asleep. The two youngest children were in a crib near the fireplace. Katrine grabbed them before the debris reached the floor. Friedrich threw his body over the three older children, shielding them from falling wood and plaster. No one was killed. No one was seriously hurt. But the house was gone. The entire center section was open to the sky, snow pouring in, wind howling through the gap. Everything they owned, the furniture, the clothing, the food stores, was buried under rubble and snow, and the shattered remains of a roof that Friedrich had patched every spring and prayed would hold every winter. They moved in with relatives in town. 8 people in a house built for 4. The children slept on the floor. Katrine didn't sleep at all for 3 days. But it was the Harwell family that broke the town's heart. They lived south of Ember Ridge in a small frame house, set back from the road in a stand of hemlock trees. The father, Thomas Harwell, was a quiet man who worked at the sawmill. The mother, Mary, took in mending. They had 2 children, a boy of 7 named William, a girl of 4 named Eliza. On the night of December 22nd, the temperature outside their house dropped to 26 below zero. The fire in the main room, a large stone fireplace that Thomas had kept burning continuously for weeks, was the only source of heat. Thomas and Mary had been splitting frozen wood for 3 straight days, working in shifts, one of them always feeding the fire while the other swung the axe. They were exhausted in a way that goes beyond tiredness, that reaches into the central nervous system and begins shutting things down. Their movements had become mechanical, automatic, stripped of thought or awareness. That night, Mary fed the fire at 10 o'clock. The children were asleep in the back room, bundled under quilts and blankets. Thomas was already asleep in the chair by the hearth, his chin on his chest, his hand still holding the poker. Mary sat down beside him. She would rest for just a moment, just close her eyes. She woke at 5 in the morning. The fire was out, not banked, not smoldering. Out. The last coal had died sometime in the night, and the cold had moved in like water filling a hole. The inside of the house was 12 degrees. Frost covered the windows, the walls, the furniture. Thomas's breath came in small, white clouds. Mary knew before she reached the back room. She knew the way a mother knows in that place beyond logic and reason and hope, the place where the body understands what the mind hasn't yet accepted. The children were in their bed. William lay on his side, facing the wall. Eliza was curled against his back, her small hands tucked under her chin. They looked like they were sleeping. They were not sleeping. The cold had taken them sometime in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Quietly, gently, even if such a word can be applied to something so terrible. They had not suffered. They had not cried out. They had simply grown colder and colder until the shivering stopped and the sleep became something deeper, and the small, warm bodies that had been alive with laughter and motion and noise just hours before became still. Mary Harwell's scream was heard by the nearest neighbor a quarter-mile away. The funeral was held 3 days later in the Lutheran church. Reverend Crane spoke. He said the words that pastors say. He spoke of God's plan and of a heaven where children never grow cold. The words hung in the air of the church like smoke, and nobody quite believed them, but nobody said so. The ground was too frozen to dig graves. The coffins, 2 small pine boxes built by Gunnar Reinhardt himself, with hands that shook, not from cold but from grief, were stored in the church basement until spring. At the service, Mary Harwell sat in the front pew and stared straight ahead. She did not cry. She did not move. She looked like a woman whose soul had left her body and gone somewhere else, somewhere the cold couldn't reach, somewhere the loss couldn't follow. Thomas stood beside her. He held her hand. He said nothing. What could he say? What words exist for that? On the night of December 22nd, the same night the Harwell children died, Clara Whitfield woke in her shelter to a sensation she had never felt before. Tightness in her chest, in her throat, A difficulty drawing breath that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with air. The oxygen in the chamber felt thin, stretched, insufficient. Each breath brought less than the one before, and her lungs responded by working harder, faster, pulling at an atmosphere that was slowly abandoning her. She sat up. The lantern was dim, its flame reduced to a feeble orange nub barely larger than a match head. Flames need oxygen the same way lungs do, and this flame was telling her what her body already knew. The ventilation pipe was blocked. She knew it instantly. The snow. 18 inches of it driven by 40-mile-an-hour winds into drifts that could bury a fence post. The outlet of the pipe hidden behind the firewood stack at the back of the shed was under snow. Sealed, the gentle circulation that kept her alive, the cold air and the warm air, out the quiet breathing of the earth had stopped. She had hours, maybe less. Carbon dioxide was building. The symptoms would progress from breathlessness to headache, to confusion to unconsciousness. After that, the body would continue breathing for a while, pulling in air that no longer sustained it until the heart starved and struggling simply stopped. Clara did not panic. She could not afford to panic. Panic accelerates the heart rate, deepens, the breathing consumes oxygen faster. Panic in a sealed underground chamber with depleted air was as lethal as the cold itself. She moved to the trap door, unlatched the wooden peg, pushed upward. The door resisted. Something was on top of it. Firewood, snow, the weight of a winter that was trying very hard to kill her. She pushed harder, bracing her feet against the chamber floor, driving her shoulders into the wooden panel. It shifted. An inch. Two. Cold air rushed in through the gap, so cold it burned her face, but she breathed it in like it was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. She pushed the door open fully. Logs rolled away across the shed floor. Snow swirled in through the cracks in the walls, fine and dry, and glittering in the lamplight from below. Bess stirred in her pen, turning her massive head to look at Clara with mild curiosity. The temperature inside the woodshed was well below zero. The temperature outside Clara would later learn was 25 below. The wind had died, but the air itself was savage, a still impatient cold that consumed heat the way fire consumes paper. Clara climbed out of the shelter. Her hands were bare. She hadn't taken time to find her gloves. She wore Robert's wool coat over her sleeping clothes and nothing on her feet but wool stockings. She moved to the back of the shed, pushed through the stacked firewood, and found the outlet of the ventilation pipe. Buried. A solid plug of snow and ice packed tight by wind and cold, sealing the pipe completely. She clawed at it with her fingers. The snow was hard as concrete. Her nails broke. Her fingertips split. She grabbed a stick from the woodpile and jabbed it into the pipe, ramming it forward, breaking the plug loose in chunks that fell away into the darkness below. Air moved. She felt it. A faint whisper of circulation resuming warm air from the chamber below, pushing up through the pipe, melting the edges of the remaining ice, widening the channel. She stood there in the dark in 25 below zero in her stockings and her dead husband's coat, her hands bleeding in her breath, coming in ragged clouds, and she waited until she was sure the pipe was clear. 1 minute. 2. The air continued to flow. The blockage was gone. Then the cold found her. It came all at once, as if it had been waiting politely and now lost patience. Her feet went numb, first the stockings useless against the frozen floor of the shed. Then her hands, already damaged, already bleeding, stiffened into claws. Her legs began to shake. Her jaw clenched. The shivering started deep in her core and radiated outward in waves that she couldn't control. She had to get back underground. Now. Every second above the surface was a second the cold was stripping heat from her body. She had minutes before hypothermia set in, before the confusion started, before her muscles locked and her mind went foggy, and she joined the growing list of people that this winter had decided to take. She made it to the trap door. She lowered herself in her arms, trembling so violently she nearly lost her grip on the frame. She pulled the door shut, latched it, climbed down, collapsed onto the straw. For a long time she lay there shaking. The oven had gone cold while she was above. The stones held some residual warmth, but not enough. She pulled every blanket around her, every hide, every piece of fabric she owned, and she curled into a ball and shook and shook and shook. Slowly, gradually, the earth did what the earth does. The walls radiated their stored warmth. The insulation held the heat close. The shivering subsided from violence to tremor to an occasional shudder. Her hands throbbed. She could feel the blood returning to her fingers, a sensation like needles being driven under the nails, excruciating and welcome at the same time. She flexed them. They moved. They all moved. Nothing lost. She lay in the dark and breathed the cool, clean air flowing gently through the chamber air that she had nearly died to restore, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. This was not a story about endurance. This was not a story about pride or stubbornness or proving anyone wrong. This was a negotiation with death conducted daily in the dark alone, and death was patient and thorough and never stopped testing the terms. She rebuilt the fire, she heated the stones, she wrapped them in cloth and placed them around her body and lay back down. She did not sleep for the rest of that night. On the morning of December 23rd, Gunnar Reinhardt sat at his kitchen table and stared at the last chair in the house that was still a chair. Everything else was gone. The spare chairs had been the first to go broken apart with a hatchet and fed to the fireplace 3 days ago. Then the small table in the children's room. Then the cabinet where Ingrid kept her mother's china. The china first removed and wrapped in cloth and set on the floor. The cabinet itself dismantled with shaking hands and burned plank by plank. Then the workbench in the back room, the one Gunnar had built when they first moved in, the one where he'd carved wooden toys for the girls on Christmas Eve every year for the past 10 years. He'd burned the toys too. The little horse, the little wagon, the little doll with the painted face. Ingrid had watched him do it. She hadn't said anything. There was nothing to say. You burn what you have to burn. Sentiment doesn't keep children alive. Their daughters, Marin and Britta, 9 and 11, sat on the floor near the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket in the house. They had stopped playing days ago. They had stopped talking, mostly. They sat and watched the fire with wide eyes that tracked every flame, every ember, every shift and settle of the burning wood, as if the fire were a living thing whose mood they needed to monitor. On the 22nd, the girls had cried. Long, shuddering sobs that shook their small bodies and turned their faces red and wet. They cried because they were cold, because their feet hurt, because they were hungry and scared, and the world outside the window was white and empty, and the house was making sounds. It shouldn't make groaning sounds, cracking sounds, the sounds of a structure under stress. Then they stopped crying. That was the moment Gunnar knew they were running out of time. When children cry, they are fighting. When they stop, they are surrendering. Marin sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. Britta leaned against her sister, motionless, staring at nothing. Ingrid's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold a cup. The tea, what little they had left, sloshed over the rim and ran down her fingers. She set the cup on the floor and pressed her hands between her knees and closed her eyes and breathed. Gunnar looked at the chair. He looked at the fireplace. He picked up the hatchet. That evening, Christmas Eve, as the last of the chair burned down to coals, Gunnar Reinhardt stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the white world. The sky was clearing. The stars were appearing one by one. The cold was settling in for another night. And then he saw it. To the northwest, barely visible against the dark tree line, a thin column of smoke, rising straight up in the still air, steady, persistent, coming from the direction of the old Whitfield property. She's alive, he said. Ingrid looked up. Clara Whitfield, Gunnar said. He's still alive. I saw smoke 2 days ago and I see it now. Ingrid stared at him. That woman has nothing. She's probably burning her last stick of wood. She'll be dead by morning. Gunnar shook his head slowly. If she were dead, the cow would be dead. And I saw the cow through the shed window last week when I passed on the road. Standing up, chewing, calm as anything. A silence settled between them. She knows something, Gunnar said quietly. She knows something we don't. They made the decision that night. On Christmas morning, 1891, the Reinhardt family dressed in every piece of clothing they owned. Gunnar wore 2 shirts, a wool vest, his heaviest coat, 2 pairs of socks, his boots, a scarf wrapped 3 times around his face, and a fur-lined hat that had belonged to his father. Ingrid wore her coat over 2 sweaters over a flannel nightgown. The girls were wrapped in blankets over their coats, their hands inside socks, because their mittens had been lost weeks ago, their feet stuffed with straw, inside boots 2 sizes too large. They looked like bundles of fabric with eyes. They stepped outside into a world that was 15 degrees below zero and utterly silent. The snow was knee-deep on the road, deeper in the drifts. The sky was the color of pale iron. The sun hung low on the southeastern horizon, weak and distant, providing light but no warmth like a lantern behind the frosted glass. They walked 3 miles. Gunnar broke trail. Each step required lifting his leg clear of the snow, planting it forward, compacting the surface, then repeating. It was exhausting. Within a quarter-mile, his thighs were burning. Within half a mile, his breathing was ragged. The girls walked in his footsteps, stepping where he'd stepped, following the path he'd made. Ingrid brought up the rear, her arms around Britta's shoulders, urging her forward when the girls slowed. They didn't speak. Speaking required opening the mouth, exposing the throat-wasting energy on words that didn't move feet. They walked in silence, 4 figures crossing a white emptiness, their breath trailing behind them in small clouds that dissolved into nothing. The walk took over an hour. By the time the Whitfield property came into view, Gunnar's hands were numb inside his gloves. Ingrid's face was so cold she couldn't feel her cheeks. Maren was stumbling every few steps, her coordination failing, a sign that her core temperature was dropping. Britta hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. The woodshed stood at the far edge of the property, leaning slightly to the east, its boards weathered to the color of old bone. Snow lay heavy on the roof. Icicles hung from the eaves like teeth, and from somewhere near the back wall, a thin ribbon of smoke rose into the still air. Gunnar reached the door. He knocked. His fist against the wood made a dull, frozen sound. No answer. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in the cold, a sharp, metallic shriek that sounded almost human. Inside, the air was different. Not warm exactly, but not the killing cold of outside. It was the temperature of a root cellar, a meat locker, a space that was connected to the earth rather than exposed to the sky. Bess stood in her pen, massive and calm, her breath rising in slow plumes. She turned her head to look at them with brown eyes that held nothing but bovine patience. The space smelled like hay and animal heat and wood smoke and something else, something deeper and older. Earth. The smell of earth. And then Gunnar saw the trap door. It was cut into the floor near the center of the shed, partially obscured by scattered firewood. A rectangle of darker wood hinged on one side with a gap along the edge where the light from below seeped through. He stared at it. He didn't understand what he was looking at. A cellar. A root store. The Whitfield property had a root cellar he knew near the cabin. Not here. Not under the woodshed. The trap door moved, lifted. Light spilled up from below, warm and amber, the color of lantern flame. A hand appeared on the edge. Then a head. Then a face. Clara Whitfield climbed out of the earth. She was thin, thinner than Gunnar remembered. The bones of her face were prominent under skin that was pale but not sickly. Her hair was tied back, dark strands escaping at the temples, and there was a smudge of soot on her left cheek and another on her chin. She wore Robert's wool coat, the same one she'd worn every day since his death, and beneath it a heavy flannel shirt in layers of fabric that made her look wider than she was. But she was not shivering. She was not frostbitten. Her lips were not blue. Her fingers were not swollen. Her eyes, dark brown and steady and utterly alert, moved from Gunnar to Ingrid to Maren to Britta. She looked at the 2 girls. She saw the blankets wrapped around their bodies. She saw the socks on their hands. She saw Marin swaying slightly on her feet, the early signs of hypothermia, the body beginning to shut down the outposts in order to save the capital. "You're cold," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Ingrid made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her lips were too frozen to form language. Her eyes were wet. She tried to speak, and what came out was some sudden and raw, the sound of a woman who had been holding herself together for days and had just been offered the one thing she couldn't give herself: hope. Gunnar tried to talk. His voice broke on the first syllable. He swallowed. Tried again. Couldn't. Clara set the lantern on the floor of the shed. "Come," she said. She led them down, one by one, through the trap door down into the chamber. Gunnar went first, lowering himself carefully, his boots finding the packed earth floor. Then Marin, handed down by her mother, light as a bundle of sticks. Then Britta. Then Ingrid. They stood in the underground room and felt the warmth. It was not the roaring heat of a fireplace. It was not the blast of a cast-iron stove with a belly full of oak. It was something subtler and deeper, a warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the earth surrounding them on all sides. The clay oven in the corner glowed with a soft orange light. The stones around it radiated heat like living things. The air was still and dry and breathable. The girls stood motionless, their faces changing, color returning, feeling returning. The particular expression of a child who has been cold for so long that warmth itself feels foreign and has to be relearned. Marin reached out and touched the wall, smooth packed earth, dry and solid. "Warm. It's warm," she whispered. She said it with such surprise, such wonder, that it sounded almost like a prayer. Clara ladled hot water from the copper pot on the oven and handed tin cups to each of them. The water was not flavored. It was not sweetened. It was simply hot, and holding it was like holding a small piece of the sun. She gave the girls pieces of hardtack softened in warm water. She didn't have much, she couldn't afford to give much, but she gave what she could, and she did it without comment, without complaint, without making anyone feel like a burden. They stayed for 2 hours, warming, thawing, returning to life. Gunnar studied the chamber, he studied the oven, he studied the ventilation pipe, the straw floor, the wool and hide bedding, the sealed food crates, the marks scratched on the wall. He was a carpenter, he understood construction, and what he was looking at he recognized was not a desperate act of survival, it was engineering. Careful, deliberate, informed engineering designed by someone who understood heat and insulation and airflow and thermal mass in a way that he had never been taught and had never thought to ask about. When they finally rose to leave, Gunnar stood at the base of the trap door and looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady now. His hands had stopped shaking. "I'll remember this." Clara nodded. Her expression was quiet, unreadable. The face of a woman who had been living alone underground for 6 weeks and had learned to keep her thoughts inside. "Tell no one," she said. Gunnar promised. He meant it too. In that moment, standing in the warm earth, looking at this woman who should have been dead, and wasn't he meant it with everything he had. But some promises are too heavy to carry. And by the next morning, the story was already spreading. By December 26, 11, people had come to the woodshed. They came alone and in pairs, wrapped in whatever clothing they could find, trudging through the snow with the desperate, determined faces of people who had run out of options. Some had heard from Gunnar. Others had heard from Ingrid, who had told one person, just one, in a neighbor named Mrs. Eklund, who had told her sister, who had told the woman at the dry goods counter, who had told everyone. Clara didn't turn anyone away. She brought them down in shifts, 3 or 4 at a time, letting them warm by the oven for an hour or two. She gave them heated stones wrapped in cloth to carry home, stones that would radiate warmth for hours, that could be tucked into a bed or held against the chest or placed in a child's crib. She shared what food she could spare, a cup of broth here, a piece of hardtack there, never enough to deplete her own stores dangerously, but always enough to matter. and she explained. In simple, direct terms, the way her father would have explained it, she told them how the shelter worked, how the earth at 6 feet held steady between 55 and 70 degrees, how clay soil insulated better than wood, how river stones absorbed heat and radiated it back, how a ventilation pipe kept the air breathable, how a cow overhead was as good as a furnace. Some listened carefully, taking mental notes, asking questions, already thinking about how to adapt the principles to their own homes and barns and root cellars. Others were too tired, too shocked, or too proud to really hear her. They took the warmth. They took the stones. They went home and survived another day. Clara gave everything she could. And every night after the last visitor left and the trap door closed and the silence returned, she descended alone into the earth and lay down and stared at the ceiling and calculated how much food was left, how much fuel, how many days. The numbers were shrinking. The blade was getting thinner, but she didn't stop. She didn't turn anyone away, and she didn't explain why, because there was nothing to explain. You help people because they need help. That's all. That's the whole reason. On December 28th in the late afternoon, Clara climbed up through the trap door to feed Bess and check the ventilation pipe. The light outside the shed was gray and flat, the sun already gone behind the tree line, the shadows stretching long across the snow. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on snow, 2 sets, slow, heavy, the particular sound of men walking who don't want to be walking. She moved to the shed door and opened it. Harlan and Virgil Whitfield stood 10 yards away. They were gaunt. Harlan's narrow face had gone hollow, the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones, his pale eyes sunken in dark sockets. His brass button coat hung loose on his frame. Virgil's jaw, that hard limestone jaw, was clenched against the cold, but his lips were cracked and his hands, gloveless, were the wrong color. White at the tips, red at the knuckles, the early stages of frostbite that would leave permanent damage if not treated soon. Their house, Clara would later learn, was a 2-story frame structure with a large fireplace and a good chimney. It should have been adequate, but they had run out of firewood 2 days earlier. Like everyone else, they had underestimated the winter. Like everyone else, they had burned through their supply faster than planned, feeding the fire against a cold that consumed fuel the way a river consumes snowmelt. They had burned furniture. They had burned books. They had burned anything that would catch. It wasn't enough. Virgil's wife had taken their children to her sister's house in town, where at least there were more bodies to share warmth. Harlan and Virgil had stayed behind, stubbornly, stupidly, believing the cold would break. It hadn't, and now they stood in the snow outside the woodshed of the woman they had tried to destroy, and they said nothing. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They didn't demand or threaten or posture. They just stood there, silent, shoulders hunched, eyes on the ground. Clara looked at them for a long time. She looked at Harlan, who had unfolded the deed on her porch rail, and told her with banker's politeness that she had 30 days to leave the only home she'd ever known. She looked at Virgil, who had kicked her door, who had laughed at her, who had said, "Let the winter have her," with the casual cruelty of a man who didn't consider her fully human. She looked at Virgil's hands, white at the fingertips, dying. The silence stretched out across the snow between them, thin and taut as wire. Then Clara stepped aside. She held the door open and she stepped aside and she said nothing because nothing needed to be said. And the 2 brothers walked into the woodshed and stood among the straw and the smell of the cow and the thin warmth rising from the earth below. And they did not meet her eyes. They came down one at a time. Harlan went first. He lowered himself through the trap door with the stiff, careful movements of a man whose body had stopped cooperating hours ago. His boots found the packed earth floor. His hands gripped the frame knuckles, white tendons standing out like cords under skin that looked too thin to hold anything together. He stood in the chamber and blinked in the lantern light and said nothing. Virgil followed. He dropped through the opening rather than climbed, landing heavily, his knees buckling for a moment before he caught himself against the wall. His palm pressed flat against the smooth earth, and Clara saw his face change. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in stories with wide eyes and open mouths and gasps of recognition. It was smaller than that, subtler, a faint slackening around the brow, a loosening of the muscles across the forehead. The almost imperceptible shift that occurs when a body that has been clenched against the cold for days finally encounters warmth and begins involuntarily to release. He pulled his hand back from the wall as if the warmth had startled him. Then he put it back. Clara descended last. She pulled the trap door shut above them, latched it with the wooden peg, and moved to the clay oven. She fed it a small handful of sticks. The fire caught. The stones began to warm. The chamber, already holding steady near 55 degrees, settled into its quiet work of keeping the cold at bay. She filled the copper pot from a sealed jug of snowmelt and set it on the flat surface of the oven to heat. She took 2 tin cups from the wooden crate where she kept her utensils and set them on the floor near the oven. She did all of this without speaking, without hurrying, without looking at the 2 men who stood against the far wall of her shelter, like prisoners who had been brought somewhere they didn't understand. The water heated. She poured it into the cups. She held them out. Harlan took his with both hands. His fingers closed around the tin slowly, the way fingers close around something precious, something that might be taken away. He held the cup against his chest and bowed his head slightly and drank. The sound he made was barely audible, a low exhale through the nose, the sound of a man swallowing something that went deeper than his throat. Virgil took his cup with his right hand. His left, Clara noticed, stayed pressed against his thigh. He hadn't moved it since he'd come down. The fingers were curled inward, rigid, the color of old tallow. He drank the water in 3 long swallows and then held the empty cup in his lap and stared at the floor. Clara refilled it without being asked. She heated 2 river stones in the oven, turning them with a pair of iron tongs she'd fashioned from a bent nail and a piece of fence wire. When the stones were hot enough to radiate, she wrapped each one in a double layer of cloth, the same method she'd used 100 times over the past 6 weeks, and placed them on the floor between the brothers. Harlan picked his up and held it against his stomach, both hands wrapped around it. He closed his eyes. The lines on his face, deep grooves cut by cold and hunger, and whatever else he'd been carrying, softened in the oven light. Virgil looked at his stone for a long moment before touching it. When he finally picked it up, he held it in his right hand and pressed it gently, carefully against the frozen fingers of his left. The warmth reached the damaged tissue. Clara could see the exact moment it did because Virgil's jaw tightened and his eyes went bright with pain. Blood returning, nerves firing, tissue that had been going numb and dark, remembering what it was supposed to feel. He made no sound. His jaw worked. His eyes stayed fixed on the wall, but the pain was written across his body in the language of rigid shoulders and locked knees and shallow breathing. Clara watched him. She knew what frostbite looked like in its stages. Virgil's fingers were 2nd degree, maybe early 3rd. The skin was white and waxy, but not yet blackened. The tissue beneath was swollen, but still yielded when pressed. There was still feeling, even if that feeling was agony. If the blood returned fully, if the tissue thawed without rupturing, he might keep the fingers. All of them. If he'd waited another day, he wouldn't have. She didn't say any of this. She didn't lecture. She didn't point out the irony of a man who had wanted the winter to kill her, now sitting in her shelter with dying hands being kept alive by the very warmth he tried to deny her. She didn't need to. The irony was in the room with them, thick as the smell of wood smoke and clay, and everyone could feel it. They sat for 3 hours. 3 hours in the dim amber light of the lantern in the oven. 3 hours of silence broken only by the soft crackle of burning sticks and the occasional shifting of Bess's weight on the floorboards above, and the distant muffled sound of wind crossing the frozen surface of the world. Nobody spoke about what had happened. Nobody spoke about the deed or the 30 days or the firewood that had been cut off or the grain that had been withheld, or the words that had been said outside the woodshed door on a November afternoon that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. They just sat and were warm and drank hot water and held stones that radiated heat like small captured suns. It was the closest thing to peace that Clara had felt in months. Not happiness, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the absence of conflict, which in the middle of the worst winter in 15 years in a hole in the ground 6 feet below the surface of the earth was enough. When the time came to leave, Harlan rose first. He set his cup on the floor, placed the cooled stone beside it, and straightened up as much as the low ceiling would allow. He moved to the base of the trap door and stopped. His back was to Clara. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way they pulled upward and inward, the posture of a man gathering himself to do something difficult. He stood there for several seconds, his head slightly bowed, his hands at his sides. "Thank you," he said. The words came out barely above a whisper. Rough, stripped. The voice of a man who had not said those words in a very long time and wasn't entirely sure he remembered how. Clara nodded, though he couldn't see her. She said nothing. Harlan climbed out through the trap door and stood in the woodshed above, stamping his feet against the cold floor, adjusting his coat. Clara could hear his boots on the boards, slow and deliberate, the sound of a man preparing himself to go back out into the world that was trying to kill him. Virgil stood. He was slower about it. His left hand, the damaged one he held cradled against his chest. Now, the fingers slightly curled, the warm stone still pressed between them and his body. He moved toward the trap door and paused. He did not turn around. He did not speak. He stood at the base of the opening with his shoulders rigid and his jaw set, and whatever was happening inside him locked down tight behind a face that refused to show it. Then he climbed out. The trap door swung shut. Boots crossed the shed floor. The outside door opened, creaked closed. Clara sat alone in the chamber. She heard them walking away, the crunch of boots on frozen snow growing fainter, fading south along the road. And then she heard nothing. Just the fire, just the cow, just the earth. She climbed up to the woodshed to latch the outer door. Through the crack between the boards, she could see the two brothers walking away across the snow, their dark shapes growing smaller against the white landscape. Harlan walked with his head down, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Virgil walked beside him, and then Virgil looked back. Just once, a single glance over his shoulder at the woodshed, at the thin column of smoke rising from the back wall at the door Clara stood behind. His face was too far away to read. The expression, whatever it was, lasted less than a second. Then he turned forward and kept walking and didn't look back again. Clara watched until they disappeared beyond the tree line. Then she closed the door, climbed back down into the shelter, and sat beside the oven with her hands folded in her lap. She was very tired. Not the tiredness of a long day's work or a poor night's sleep. A deeper exhaustion, the kind that settles into the marrow and becomes part of the structure. 6 weeks underground. 6 weeks of rationing and calculating and monitoring and maintaining. 6 weeks of being alone with nothing but a cow and a lantern and the memory of a man who'd built everything she was now fighting to keep. She lay down. She pulled the quilt to her chin, the one her mother had pieced together from a dozen different fabrics in 1872, faded now, worn thin in places, but still holding together the way old things hold together when they've been made with care. She thought about Robert, not about his death, not about the 6 terrible days or the burial in the rain or the limestone marker scratched with a nail. She thought about the first winter, 1880, the year they married, the year they came to this land. The cabin wasn't finished yet. The walls were up, but the roof was only half shingled, and the chimney was still 3 courses short of complete. Robert had worked 16-hour days through the autumn racing the season, trying to close the structure before the cold came. He almost made it. Almost. The first frost arrived on October 29th, and the chimney still needed 2 more days of work, and the north wall still had a gap above the door frame where the header beam didn't sit flush. They spent that first night with a fire on the bare dirt floor, the smoke rising through the gap where the chimney should have been, the cold seeping in through every crack and joint in the unfinished structure. Clara had hung blankets over the windows. Robert had stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps. They huddled together on a straw mattress laid on the floor, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, and listened to the wind testing the walls. "Are you cold?" Robert had asked. His arm was around her. His body was warm and solid against hers. "No," she'd said, and it was true. Not because the cabin was warm. It wasn't. The fire was inadequate, the insulation non-existent, the wind relentless. But Robert was there, and his arm was around her. And the land they were lying on was theirs, every rock and root and frozen clod of it. And tomorrow they would wake up and keep building. "This land is ours, Clara," he'd said, quietly, not a boast, a fact. "No one can take it." She'd believed him. She'd believed him for 11 years. She believed him still lying 6 feet below the surface of that same land, in the dark, in the cold alone. "I kept it, Robert," she whispered. "I kept it." The fire crackled. The oven glowed. The earth held its warmth around her like a hand. And for the first time since the 14th of April, since the morning she'd sat beside his body and watched the light change through the window and listened to the birds begin, Clara cried. Not the sharp, violent crying of fresh grief, something quieter, slower, tears that ran down the sides of her face and into the straw and made no sound at all. Tears that had been waiting months for permission to fall, held back by the sheer mechanics of survival, by the necessity of digging and building and calculating and enduring. She cried for Robert. She cried for the life they'd built and the future they'd lost. She cried for the children they never had, the ones who would have inherited this land, who would have carried his name and her father's knowledge and the memory of everything that had been poured into these 87 acres. She cried because she had kept her promise to a dead man, and he would never know it. She cried because keeping that promise had nearly killed her. And she cried because despite everything, despite the cold and the hunger, and the brothers and the loneliness and the long dark nights underground, she was alive. She was alive, and the earth was warm, and the fire was burning, and that was enough. The coal broke on the 2nd of January, 1892. It didn't happen all at once. The cold never leaves that way. It retreated in stages grudgingly, the way an army withdraws from captured territory. The temperature climbed from -15 to 0, then from 0 to 10, then from 10 to 20. Each degree felt like a gift. Each notch on the thermometer felt like a door opening onto a room that had been sealed shut for weeks. By January 5th, the mercury hit 35. Snow began to melt from the south-facing rooftops, the drips falling from the eaves in slow, steady rhythms that sounded like clocks ticking. Icicles that had hung from every ledge and gutter, like rows of glass teeth, began to shorten, then thin, then fall shattering on the frozen ground below, with sounds like breaking china. By January 8th, it was 42 degrees, and the sky was a pale, watery blue that people had almost forgotten existed. The snow was still deep in the shadows, still piled against north-facing walls and in the hollows beneath the pines. But the roads were clearing. The paths between houses were opening up. Smoke rose from chimneys with a cheerfulness that seemed almost defiant, as if the fires inside knew they had won. People emerged, slowly, cautiously, the way animals emerge from their burrows after a storm. They stood in their doorways and blinked at the sunlight and breathed air that didn't burn their lungs. They looked at each other with the particular expression of people who have survived something together and aren't quite sure yet what it means. The damage was everywhere. 3 roofs collapsed. 14 families had burned through their entire winter's supply of firewood and had resorted to burning furniture, fences, outbuildings, anything combustible. 6 people had suffered frostbite severe enough to require medical attention. Amos Pruitt would carry the stumps of his missing fingers for the rest of his life. The Becker family's house was a ruin open to the sky, the snow-filled interior already beginning to rot. Friedrich Becker stood in front of it on January 10th and stared at it for 20 minutes without moving, then turned around and walked to his brother-in-law's house and asked for a saw. And the Harwell children were still in the church basement in their small pine coffins, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to receive them. The town mourned, not loudly, not publicly, the way cities mourn with memorials and speeches and organized grief. Ember Ridge mourned the way small towns mourn quietly, privately, in the spaces between chores and meals, and the slow rebuilding of damaged lives. A hand on a shoulder, a plate of food left on a doorstep, a nod across the church aisle that said, "I know," without requiring any words. Reverend Crane held a service of thanksgiving on January 11th. The church was full, every pew occupied. People stood along the walls and in the back and spilled out through the open doors into the cold sunshine. He spoke about endurance. He spoke about community. He spoke about the grace of God and the strength of the human spirit. He did not mention Clara Whitfield. Nobody did, not publicly. The story of the woodshed and the underground shelter had spread through the town like water through sand, reaching everyone spoken in kitchens and barns and general store aisles, but always in low voices, always with a certain tone, a mixture of awe and discomfort that people couldn't quite name. Oh, because what she had done was extraordinary. A woman alone, abandoned, condemned, had not only survived the worst winter in 15 years, but had sheltered 11 people and kept them alive using nothing but knowledge and earth and stone and will. Discomfort because what she had done was also an indictment of the brothers who had tried to destroy her, of the neighbors who had watched and done nothing, of the town that had assumed she would die and hadn't lifted a finger to prevent it. Nobody wanted to say that part out loud, so Clara's name lived in whispers, in the spaces between words, in the glances people exchanged when someone mentioned the winter, the random, the week when everything almost fell apart. She was there in all of those conversations, the way the foundation is there beneath a house, essential and invisible. Until Theodore Hilliard arrived. He came in late January on a Tuesday, stepping off the afternoon mail coach, with a leather bag over one shoulder and a notebook in his left hand. He was a reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal based in Madison, a man in his early 40s with a sharp face and quick eyes, and the particular energy of someone who has traveled a long way because he believes there's a story at the end of the road. He'd heard about Clara from a letter. One of the 11 people she'd sheltered, a woman named Mrs. Eklund, had a cousin in Madison who worked as a typesetter at the Journal. The cousin had mentioned it over supper one evening, casually, the way people mention things they find interesting but don't consider important. A widow in the north, an underground shelter. 11 lives saved during the worst cold snap in a decade and a half. The editor heard about it the next morning. By noon, Hilliard was on a coach heading north. He found Clara at the woodshed on a cold gray afternoon. The snow was still deep around the property, but the paths were beaten down, marked by the footprints of the many people who had come and gone over the past weeks. Bess stood in her pen inside the shed, placid as ever. The thin ribbon of smoke still rose from the back wall. Hilliard knocked. This time the door opened. Clara stood in the doorway wearing Robert's coat, her hair pulled back, her face composed. She looked at the stranger with the notebook and the leather palm and the quick eyes, and she didn't speak. She waited. Hilliard introduced himself. He explained who he was, where he was from, why he'd come. He asked if she would be willing to talk. Clara considered it, not briefly. She stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds, her eyes on his face, reading him the way a person reads weather, looking for signs of what was coming. "All right," she said. She showed him the chamber. She took him past through the trap door and let him stand in the space she had carved out of the earth with her own hands 7 weeks earlier. He stood there with his notebook open and his pencil moving and his eyes taking in everything. The smooth walls, the straw floor, the clay oven with its river stones, the ventilation pipe, the sealed food crates, The quilt on the sleeping surface, the marks scratched on the wall. He asked questions. She answered them, simply, precisely, without embellishment or self-pity or any apparent awareness that what she had done was remarkable. She described the construction of the shelter the way a carpenter describes framing a wall. She explained the physics of thermal mass the way a teacher explains arithmetic. She spoke about her father, about the mines, about the lessons he'd taught her, with the quiet affection of a daughter who understood what she'd been given. Hilliard filled 14 pages of his notebook. When he asked her why she hadn't left, why she hadn't gone to Madison or Milwaukee or anywhere else when the brothers gave her 30 days, she looked at him for a long moment before answering. "My husband built everything on this land," she said. "I helped him build it. 11 years. Every stone in that chimney, every board in this shed, every fence post on this property. We built it together. A piece of paper with his father's name on it doesn't undo that." She paused, then added more quietly, "The earth knows who worked it, even if the law doesn't." Hilliard wrote that down. The article ran on February 9, 1892. It appeared on the third page of the Wisconsin State Journal under a headline set in bold type that stretched across 4 columns. "The Woman Who Taught a Town to Survive." Hilliard had written it carefully with the precision of a man who understood that the story itself was powerful enough to carry the prose. He described the property. He described the shelter. He described the construction methods in meticulous detail, the thermal mass principles, the ventilation system, the clay oven, the use of river stones, the insulating properties of packed earth. He described Clara's background, her father's years in the Pennsylvania coal mines, the knowledge he had passed to his daughter. He described the winter, the storms, the cold, the families that had lost their homes, their health, their children. He described the 11 people who had come to the woodshed and been brought down into the earth and been kept alive by a woman who had nothing except the one thing that mattered most. And he described the brothers, not by name. Hilliard was careful about that, careful in the way that good reporters are careful when they understand that truth can destroy as easily as it can illuminate. He referred to them only as members of the deceased husband's family who had attempted to remove the widow from the property through legal and social pressure. The implication was clear. The names were unnecessary. The article was reprinted within a week. The Eau Claire Telegram ran it on February 12th. The Minneapolis Tribune picked it up on the 14th. The Detroit Free Press carried a condensed version on the 16th. By the end of February, some version of Clara Whitfield's story had appeared in newspapers across Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, and Illinois. Letters arrived at the Ember Ridge post office addressed to the Widow Whitfield, or simply The Woman in the Woodshed, Ember Ridge, Wisconsin. Some offered money, $10 here, $20 there. A woman in Milwaukee sent $50 in an envelope with a note that said, "For a woman who knows what the earth knows." A retired mining engineer in Pittsburgh sent a detailed letter praising her oven design and suggesting modifications that might improve efficiency. Several letters proposed marriage. Men from as far away as Ohio and Indiana, widowers and bachelors, and men whose loneliness had found in Clara's story some reflection of their own, wrote careful, earnest letters offering their companionship, their homes, their names. Clara read every letter. She answered none that required answers and declined politely every offer of money and marriage alike. She was not interested in charity. She was not looking for a husband. She had a home. She had land, and she intended to stay on it. The legal matter resolved itself with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. The county clerk, a methodical man named Arthur Hewitt, who had held the position for 19 years and took pride in doing things properly, read Hilliard's article on the morning it was published. He read it twice. Then he pulled the Whitfield property records from the filing cabinet in his office and spread them across his desk and studied them for an hour. The deed was clear. The land was in Ezekiel Whitfield's name. That was fact. But fact in the law is not always the end of the story. There were other facts. Clara had lived on the property for 11 years. She had worked it improved, it maintained it. She had invested her labor and her life into the land, with the understanding shared by her husband and by the community that it was her home. She had been abandoned by the deed-holding family and left to die. She had survived. She had sheltered members of that same community during a crisis. Hewitt was not a sentimental man. He didn't make decisions based on stories in newspapers or public sympathy or the moral calculus of who deserved what. He made decisions based on law. And the law in this case provided for something called adverse possession in common law property rights doctrines that recognized that occupation labor and long-term use of land could under certain circumstances constitute a legal claim. He reviewed the precedents. He consulted with the county judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Adele Presswood, who had been on the bench for 12 years and was known for decisions that were brief, precise, and unappealing to argue with. She reviewed the file, the testimony of Otto Reinhardt, and others, the newspaper article, and the property records. Her ruling was 3 sentences long. Clara Whitfield had established a common law claim to the property through continuous occupation, substantial improvement, and the absence of any formal eviction proceeding by the deed holders. The claim was recognized by the county. The matter was closed. Local officials made it known to the Whitfield family that further harassment of Clara would be viewed unfavorably by the county and the community. The message was delivered not as a threat, but as a statement of reality, the way a weatherman states that it will rain. This is how things are. Adjust accordingly. Harlan and Virgil did not contest the ruling. They did not return to the property. They did not write letters or file appeals or send lawyers. They simply stopped. Whether this was because they had accepted the ruling, or because they were ashamed, or because the winter had broken something in them that couldn't be repaired, no one knew. No one asked. And Clara, for her part, never spoke about them again. Spring came the way it always comes to northern Wisconsin, slowly and reluctantly, as if the land itself isn't sure it wants to let go of the cold. The snow retreated from the fields in patches, revealing ground that was dark and wet and smelled like the beginning of something. The creek thawed. The ice on the river broke apart and moved downstream in great jagged sheets that ground against each other, with sounds like the earth clearing its throat. Clara emerged from the shelter for the last time on March 15, 1892. She climbed through the trap door, stood in the woodshed, and opened the door to a world that was brown and gray and puddled with meltwater and more beautiful than anything she had seen in 4 months. She stood at the hood in the doorway and breathed. The air was cool but soft, no edge to it, no blade. The sun was warm on her face, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that reaches the skin and keeps going, that sinks into the muscle and the bone and the places where the cold had lodged itself and refused to leave. Bess walked out of the shed and into the pasture and stood there. Her massive head lifted, her nostrils flaring, taking in the scent of thawed earth and new grass beginning somewhere far below the surface. She looked, Clara thought, like a creature discovering a world she had forgotten existed. Clara walked to the south pasture, to the stand of white birch trees, to the flat piece of limestone with Robert's name scratched into it. The grave had settled over the winter, the earth compacting under the weight of snow and frost. A shallow depression marked the spot ringed by last year's dead grass, with a single green shoot pushing up through the brown at one edge. New growth, the first of the season. She stood there for a long time. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Robert knew. If the dead know anything, if they carry any awareness at all of the world they've left behind, he knew. She reached down and touched the limestone marker. It was cold from the night, but warming in the sun. She traced the letters of his name with her fingertip. Then she straightened up, turned around, and walked back to the cabin. There was work to do. Clara Whitfield lived on that land for another 22 years. She farmed it modestly, growing beans and corn and potatoes, keeping chickens, keeping Bess, until the old cow died in 1898 and was replaced by a younger animal Clara bought from the Lindgrens. She maintained the cabin, the fences, the woodshed. She patched what needed patching and rebuilt what needed rebuilding and kept the property in the same condition of honest functional order that she and Robert had established together. She kept to herself mostly. She was not unfriendly, but she was private. She went to town for supplies once a month, exchanged pleasantries with the shopkeepers, nodded to the people she passed on the road. She attended church on Christmas and Easter, sitting in the back pew, leaving before the socializing began. She was civil with the Lingrens, who, over the years, became something close to friends, or at least the nearest thing to friends that Clara seemed to want. She never remarried. She received proposals periodically, especially in the years immediately following the newspaper article when her story was still fresh in the public memory. She declined them all with the same quiet courtesy. She was not lonely, or if she was, she didn't show it. She had the land, she had her work. She had the memory of a man who had built everything with his hands and the knowledge of a father who had taught her how to survive with nothing. Gunnar Reinhardt came by occasionally. He brought firewood sometimes, or a sack of flour from the mill, or a jar of Ingrid's plum preserves. He never stayed long. He'd sit on the porch for a few minutes, talk about the weather, the crops, the children, the small currency of rural life, and then he'd stand and nod and leave. He never mentioned the shelter or the winter or the Christmas morning his family had walked 3 miles through the snow to a woodshed where a woman they barely knew saved their lives. He didn't need to. It was there between them, permanent and unspoken, the way gratitude is when it runs too deep for words. Maren and Britta Reinhardt grew up. They married. They had children of their own. And in their families, the story was told and retold the way stories are in families, changing slightly with each telling, gaining detail here, losing detail there, but keeping always at its center the image of a thin woman climbing out of the earth with a lantern in her hand and clear eyes and 2 words that carried more weight than a sermon. You're cold. Clara died in her sleep on the 3rd of March, 1913. She was 54 years old. The doctor said it was her heart. Not a dramatic failure, not the sudden, clutching collapse that takes some people without warning. A quiet stopping. A gentle cessation, the way a clock winds down, the mechanism slowing and slowing until the last gear turns and the hands go still. They found her in the cabin, in the bed Robert had built under the quilt her mother had made. The fire had burned down to coals, but the room was still warm. On the table beside the bed, a tin cup with the remains of tea, a lantern extinguished, a book open and face down, the spine cracked from years of reading. She was buried beside Robert at the edge of the south pasture under the birch trees. The ground was soft from early spring rain, the same soil she had dug from 100 times the same earth that had held warmth for her through the worst winter of her life. Reverend Crane's successor, a young man named Reverend Davies, who had heard the story but never met Clara, spoke at the graveside. A small crowd gathered. The Lingrens, a few women from the church. Gunnar Reinhardt, older now, his hair gone white, standing at the back with his hat in his hands. They marked her grave with a limestone slab like Robert's. Someone no one remembered who had carved the inscription. It read simply, Clara Whitfield, 1859 to 1913. She refused to leave. The woodshed remained standing until 1931, when it was torn down to make way for the construction of State Road 29. A crew of 8 men arrived on a Tuesday morning in April with trucks and sledgehammers and the benign indifference of people doing a job they'd done 100 times before. They knocked down the walls in an hour. They pulled up the floorboards. They were preparing to grade the site when one of the crew, a young man named Haskell, who had only been on the job for 3 weeks, put his shovel into the ground and hit empty space. He called the foreman over. They cleared away the debris and the soil and found the trap door frame, the leather hinges, long since rotted, the wood soft and dark with age, but still recognizable. Below it, the chamber. It was still there. 40 years underground, and it was still there. The walls were smooth and dry, packed earth that had hardened over the decades into something closer to stone than soil. The dimensions were exactly as they had been in 1891. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 5 feet deep at the center. The ceiling beams, the oak crossbars Clara had salvaged from the collapsed fence, were darkened with age but structurally sound. The straw on the floor had long since decomposed into a thin layer of dry organic matter, fine as dust. The clay oven sat in the northwest corner, the river stones still mortared in place, still blackened with the soot of 1,000 small fires. The ventilation pipe was gone, rusted away years ago, but the channel it had occupied was still visible in the back wall, a smooth, round tunnel angling upward through the earth. And the air inside was warm, not heated, not artificially maintained, simply warm. The way the earth is warm at 6 feet, the way it has always been warm, the way it will always be warm, regardless of the season, regardless of the weather, regardless of who lives above it and who doesn't. The foreman stood at the edge of the opening and looked down into the chamber for a long time. He was not a man given to sentiment. He was a road builder. He moved earth for a living. But he stood there looking at the smooth walls and the blackened oven and the air that rose from below, carrying a warmth that had no visible source, and he didn't give the order to fill it in. Not right away. He sent Haskell to town to find someone who knew the story. Haskell came back with an old man who walked with a cane and had white hair and steady eyes. The old man stood at the edge of the chamber and looked down and nodded slowly. "That's it," Gunnar Reinhardt said. "That's where she lived." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The chamber said it for him. The walls said it. The stones said it. The warm air rising from the earth said it in a language older than words. The crew filled in the chamber the next day. They had a road to build. The concrete was poured. The asphalt was laid. The cars began to pass over the spot where Clara Whitfield had spent a winter underground, where she had sheltered 11 strangers and 2 enemies, where she had lain in the dark and listened to the earth hold its warmth and decided night after night to keep living. The road is still there, State Road 29. It runs east to west across northern Wisconsin, a ordinary stretch of 2-lane blacktop that carries ordinary traffic past ordinary fields and woods and towns. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign indicating what lies beneath the pavement at mile marker 47. Nothing to tell the drivers passing overhead that they are crossing the spot where a woman once proved that survival is not a function of strength or wealth or luck. It is a function of knowledge and the willingness to use it when the whole world says you have nothing left. Clara Whitfield never sought fame. She never wrote a book. She never gave speeches. She never asked to be remembered. But the earth remembers. 6 feet down in the dark, in the silence, in the place where the temperature holds steady and the cold cannot reach the earth, remembers warmth. It always has. It always will.